And double check that your resort fee is included in your rate if you're staying here at the hotel. The public talk is tonight, and you can see some of the notes here. There's a cash bar. Session scribes, for everybody that's been leading sessions during the week, you'll see a link here to a Google Doc, and please provide a summary of the accomplishments and what went on during your talk, your breakout session. Those slides will be used for tomorrow's plenary. There are more t-shirts that are coming today, and the surveys are open, and there are links there. Save the date. The next LSST community meeting in Europe is coming up. And we've received some feedback already for where will you be for the eclipse, and you can start to see the line forming along there. So thank you to everybody that's provided input. And somebody's going to get a nice vignetted look from Cancun, it looks like. So, okay, so I'm going to quickly go over what the content of today's plenary will be. It's a little bit different format. It's going to start with 3 short talks that describe why verification and validation matter, what commissioning means to us, and then Beth will talk briefly on commissioning data rights. And then we're going to have a little bit of an experiment. To my knowledge, this hasn't been done at one of the previous all hands before, but we're going to have a panel session. And you'll see that there are 6 panelists listed there, and we'll have a moderator, Chuck Claver. And they're going to come up here the second half of the plenary, and they're going to talk about their own experiences and lessons learned from past commissioning and operational efforts. So we're going to give each of them an opportunity to talk, and then we're going to open it up for interaction and dialogue with the rest of the audience as well. So that should be exciting. All right, so diving right in. So the first talk is one that I'll be giving. My name is Brian Selvey. I'm the Systems Engineering Manager. And I'm going to talk about really why verification and validation matter. If you've been to some of these plenaries in the past years, we've had topics on this, but they've been more process-oriented. I'm not going to bore you with process. I guarantee you won't see the Systems Engineering V more than once in this presentation. So, but really, this is really what's the value of doing this, what could be considered extra work. And it's not extra work, but I want to try to describe to you really why this matters and what we get out of doing this. So really, why does this matter? Why are we going through this process of coming up with formal verification and validation plans? Many of you have probably had me come and bug you for input for these plans. And you might wonder why. Well, why are we going through this rigorous process? Why do I have to write all this down? What's the point? What do we get out of this? Is it just paperwork? You know, we're all smart people. We know what to do. Why don't we just go forward? Well, there are some contributing factors that we should look at as to why we do need some rigor. And we could start here with one definition of a system, which was put forth by a systems thinker named Donella Meadows, and she describes a system as an interconnected set of elements that's coherently organized in a way to achieve something. And really the thing to think about here is that it's that something. Every system achieves something, and that's why they become stable after they're built and commissioned and go into operations, and that's why they're difficult to change at that point, right? Once something achieves stability, it's very hard to change. The problem is, though, that many times that something is not always what we wanted it to do, right? And so that's really what we're talking about here, is we want to align that something that we all think that we need, the stakeholders believe we need, with the as-delivered something. Another reason why this is important is complexity grows very quickly. So most of you are probably familiar with a little bit of graph theory with nodes and edges, and we can very easily extract this and start talking about how this applies to us with components and interfaces, right? So it starts to compound very quickly. You'll see here with 2 nodes, you can get 1 theoretical edge or interface, and then it continues to go up. At 4, you get 6. And it starts to balloon very, very quickly. Once you get to 12, 66 theoretical interfaces. When you get up to 100, you've got almost 5,000 theoretical interfaces. And as you can see on the left, these are theoretical upper limits, right? In reality, if we're talking about either a social system or an engineered system, you get really more of that hub and spoke network that you looked at, that you see in the bottom left. So this is, again, an upper limit. But the point is that this does still compound, and it still gets very complicated. If we look at LSST, it's really hard to even evaluate and come up with some good metric about the number of interactions or interfaces on this project. But one corollary that we can use is our work breakdown structure, because it's a product and service oriented work breakdown structure. So it gives us a sense of the products and services that LSST is being built to deliver. And if you look across both the NSF and the DOE portions of the WBS, there are 599 nodes. And that, you'll see, gives us almost 180,000 possible interactions. And again, I'll be the first to contend that these aren't technical product edges, right? But this would be closer to the possible number of social interactions that are feasible on this project. That means all the interactions that we're having at meetings like this, all the point-to-point connections that each of you have in your conversations in your daily work, and all of those actually matter. We are part of this system. We are part of this environment, and the interactions that we have do matter. Those interactions contribute to the technical definition of LSST. So again, this is a theoretical upper limit, but it does give you some sense of how complicated LSST is. If we just start to look at, from a technical perspective, these graphs were put together by Catherine Weston, one of our systems engineers, and she's gone through and she's mined the requirements that we're tracking just at the project level. And you'll see that even just at the project level, there are over 3,000 verification events that we're tracking right now. And that's a combination of specification requirements and interface requirements. And that's just at the project level. At the subsystem level, this thing will tree out very quickly. If you start to think about then the number of requirements and interfaces at the subsystems, that compounds probably by another factor of 10. And then in many cases, we have vendors that are actually building a lot of our hardware and software for us. And we have vendor specifications and interface control documents as well. And then that's another compounding factor. So the main point here is that really the complexity is almost overwhelming. And if we don't have some formal processes and ways to manage it, it can get out of control and things can fall through the cracks. So I hope you all can understand that LSST is a complex system, but how do we manage that complexity? So one way is this model that was put forth by David Snowden and Mary Boone, and it's called this Cynefin model. That's actually the right spelling. It's pronounced Cynefin. It's a Welsh word. But they contend that there are different categories of systems going from simple to complicated to complex to chaotic. And their contention is that the ways that you approach and handle a system in one of these domains do not apply in another domain. So we have to be very conscious of what domain we are in and apply tools and processes applicable to that domain. And what a lot of us do with linear thinking, right, is what applies in the simple domain. It's the sense categorized response, the best practice. It's the I see an effect, and based on known past experiences, I can with high fidelity, guess what the causes are, or deduce the causes. When we get to complicated, this is where typical engineered systems reside, where there are many, many feedback loops, and linear cause-effect thinking in its simplest form doesn't apply anymore. Because there are so many feedback loops, we have to think about things in a different way. We have to be able to model and understand what those feedback loops do to system performance. And then in complex, that's even another domain where there's emergent behavior, which says that the sum is great, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. That as you start to integrate a system, you observe behavior that you couldn't deduce by just looking at the component behavior. Another area where the complexity domain applies is with autonomous agents, and that's a fancy word just for talking about, in one case, people, right? with all these people in this room and we start to interact, we can't model how we're all the outcomes a priori to all of these interactions beforehand. So the way that we approach a problem needs to be consistent with the domain that we're in. And I would contend that LSST is firmly on the continuum between complex and complicated. There are a lot of our systems that we can use first principles and physical models, physics-based models to analyze. That would be firmly in the complicated domain where we can come up with a model and we have very high confidence that the results will be backed up by test data, right? By empirical data. There are systems on LSST that are firmly in the complex domain, and one example would be the camera cryo-refrigeration system. This you can't analyze to first principles. I'm not an expert in this, but the constituent gases for this it's a blend of 12 different constituent gases. I believe that's the right number, and you can't deduce the thermodynamic principles to great fidelity because the system is so complex. So you have to use different approaches to deal with that. And then again, if we start to put the people in the system, which we are part of the system, we're firmly in the complex domain. We can't analyze how the interactions are going to affect the system with great confidence. So what do we do? Well, that's really why we need some systems engineering rigor. If we're in the complex domain, there are tools and processes that have been proven to work. There are things like design of experiment, agile systems engineering, agile software engineering. Those apply in the complex domain. In the complicated, here's your one opportunity to see the systems engineering B. Typical traditional systems engineering practices are very good at dealing with complicated problems, where you analyze and deduce what the system should be down to components and unit parts, and then integrate back up on the right-hand side of the V. And as you're integrating, you verify at each intermediate step. And again, if there's other approaches too that we can talk about, and one is as if we verify as early and the lowest levels possible at basically the bottom right-hand side of the V, we're pushing down in many cases from the complicated to the simple, or from the complex to the complicated domains, where we can get better knowledge about how components interact and work. So there are reasons why we would want to produce or at least apply some V&V rigor here. So that all sounds good, but it probably sounds like a lot of work. But what happens if we don't manage this complexity? Well, this is a chart from the Professional Society for Systems Engineers called INCOSE. And this shows that the bar graphs on the bottom show the amount of typical project budget that is expended in each of the phases of a project. So in the concept phase, on average, 8% of your overall budget is expended. But at the end of the concept phase, you've committed 70% of your costs based on the decisions you've already made. Right? In design, it goes to 15% of your budget has been expended, but you've committed 85%. And you'll see that the cost to extract defects goes up fairly quickly. And it's better to catch defects early, right? And so this just goes again to the concept of planning early, having verification plans to verify things at an early component level does matter. If we wait too late and we find them too late, our options to deal with these issues greatly get reduced. We may have to live with defects. We may have to come up with operational procedures to work around behavior that we don't want. Here's another example. My background is in aerospace, so so when I talk about experiences, my experiences are more from aerospace. But I think this is really still a very applicable example. This is a graph that the quality assurance organization at NASA put together for the for the space shuttle program. And the y-axis is uh, is a mirrored image, and the scale of the bars on the y-axis are a measure of the rigor of the requirements verification and quality assurance oversight as applied over time on the shuttle program. And you'll see an unfortunate repeating pattern. As complacency grows over time, you'll see that safety becomes silent. There were huge disasters. Then there's a disaster that occurs, oversight goes up, the problems go away, and over time complacency takes over again, and another disaster. And that's, it's a pattern that's obvious, but we don't seem to learn from. And I'll end with one very personal example from my past. Early in my career, as some of you know, I worked at SpaceX, and this was before I was a systems engineer. I was a launch operations engineer working on their first vehicle, the Falcon 1. And as proof, you'll see that there's an article from the Kwajalein Hourglass there on the left. That's the weekly newspaper from Kwajalein Island in the Marshall Islands, where the Falcon 1 was launched from. And I was right around employee 100 there. There's a very small team. And we spent tens of thousands of hours, man hours, developing and testing the Falcon 1. Tens of thousands of parts were designed, integrated, and tested. Hundreds of thousands of lines of software code were written and tested. And as we got closer to the launch, many of us that were involved in launch ops were putting in seven-day work weeks and got up to working 18 hours a day to prepare for this launch. What I'm going to show you next is a series of still images that will show you what happened during the launch phase, the takeoff of this vehicle. So this was the very first launch on March 26, 2006. And pay attention and see if you see anything that kind of doesn't look ordinary. Anything not look right? So 68 seconds later, from a different vantage point, there was an explosion off the coast of Omelek. The rocket was lost. I was part of the launch operations recovery team. I was on the first boat that had to go back to the small island of Omelek and have to start cataloging the pieces and collecting the debris. And we walked into a little machine shop on the island, and you'll see there we found the satellite. That was a student satellite built by students at the Air Force Academy, and all their hard work was lost as well. So after this happened, there was obviously a very large root cause analysis failure investigation that went on. And it's almost embarrassing to say what brought down this rocket. The root cause analysis was traced back to a single quarter-inch flared fitting on the pneumatic system on the first stage of this rocket. That one part that failed brought down this rocket. That fitting was used on this pneumatic line that fed compressed nitrogen to a solenoid actuator that held open the first stage main fuel valve. This part corroded. This part was not properly lock wired, so it wasn't properly verified. It backed off from the vibrations of the launch. That valve started to fail. It started to lose pressure. It started to close. The fuel oxidizer mixture ratio got off, caused that fire that you saw. So when you think about it, now looking back in hindsight, right? It's obvious now. I've gone through formal systems engineering training, and I see the value. SpaceX didn't have systems engineers back then. In fact, I don't know if they even do today. There weren't requirements. There was just people designing based on best practices. So aluminum was chosen for that part because it was lighter weight. This launch vehicle was designed to launch from a different part of the globe. This launch vehicle was supposed to launch from Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, but because of political reasons, they had to move. They moved to the Marshall Islands, which is in a completely different environment, very salt corrosive atmosphere, humidity that's typically at almost 100% all the time, and temperatures that are typically well over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. So the materials were picked on assumptions that were no longer applicable. The environmental requirements changed, and because there were no requirements written down, because there was none of that rigor, nobody thought to go check this stuff. So you could say that, all right, great, that's aerospace, that doesn't apply here. LSST is not going to blow up when we turn it on. Okay, I hope not. But the passion and commitment to succeeding that I had when I was at SpaceX, I'd contend that I at least believe all of you probably feel as well to LSST. You have that same passion and commitment and want LSST to be successful. We've got to deliver on what we've promised, right? If we don't deliver an observatory that meets the science community's expectations, I'm going to feel personal, like there's failure, and I suspect you will too. This isn't just about delivering hardware, it's our own integrity and reputations on the line as well. So SpaceX has one advantage going for them. They can just go build another rocket, right? And they did. We're not going to go build another LSST. So we really have to deliver and finish LSST on schedule and budget and deliver a quality product. I'm pretty sure the NSF is not going to go back and give us more money if we don't deliver what we said we were. So, like I said, this was before I was a formal systems engineer, and personal events like this really did make me realize that there is value in doing some of that upfront planning. Doing some of that upfront planning really can avoid big problems down the road. And so what that really made me realize is that the details do matter and planning matters. So if we go back and we look at that quote from Donella Meadows again on the definition of a system, really that's, when I talked about that something again, that's really what systems engineers are trying to do. We're trying to align the as designed, as built something with the desired something. And having some rigor and the right amount of rigor, the tailored amount of rigor in verification and validation can help us align those. Thank you. So next, so we have 3 presentations. The next one is going to be by Chuck Claiborne on what commissioning means.
Very good. Thank you, Brian. That was great. It's actually kind of very eye-opening and a little bit sobering. And so with that as a backdrop, I'm going to keep my presentation relatively short today. Some of you that were in the Monday breakout will have already heard this, but throughout the week here, since the Monday breakout, I've been hearing a lot of conversation about commissioning and verification validation. It's kind of been sort of an underwriting theme this whole week throughout all of our conversations and whatnot. And the reason for that is that, as you saw in Victor's presentation and many other presentations throughout the week, that things are coming together, and it's pretty darned exciting. And hardware is being delivered, software is being written, data are being analyzed across the board. And I came to realize this week, listening to people talk, that on this project, commissioning, we use the word commissioning rather loosely and broadly. and it means many different things to many different people. Um, for example, commissioning, in one sense, is a work breakdown structure. It's one of our WBS elements, and uh, to someone else, commissioning means this last, very final stage of understanding and putting this thing together and making it work. And to me, it means something very different. Um, uh, and so what I thought I'd do is I thought I'd take this opportunity to spend maybe about 10 minutes here and reiterate what I think our project definition, how we as a project view what commissioning is. And again, for those that were in the breakout on Monday, I apologize that this is a bit repetitious, but I think it bears repeating because I think it will help us going forward. And at the end of Brian's presentation, the very last bullet there, it says planning matters. I don't know. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but there's a very famous quote by a former president of the United States, Dwight Eisenhower, and the quote goes something like this. This won't be perfect, but it goes something like this: that going into battle, your battle plan is worthless, but the planning was essential. Right? So as we go forward and we start working out our verification plans, validation plans, and our commissioning plans, those plans are not going to go exactly as we think they're going to go, but the actual act of doing it gets us thinking about what Steve Kahn, our director, has been referring to recently as the end game. Right? We're in that very early transitionary period where we're going from thinking about builds, figure out requirements, to here's the thing, put it together, make it work. Eventually, we have to deliver a completed functioning LSST as an observatory system. So we're entering into that end game, and these plans are important for us. So as we go forward and we think about commissioning, as I think about commissioning, I think commissioning answers three basic questions. Right? So first question is, did we build the thing that we said we're going to build? That's verification. Right? So, and that's already started, right? That's happening now at the subsystem level, at the component level. We've got lenses being on the verge of being verified and accepted. We've got telescope mounts that are starting their own verification processes and test procedures with the vendor to say that, yep, we built the thing that we asked for and what we wanted to, what we said we were going to do. And the same with the software. The software is, our data processing software is continuously being verified through their continuous build process. But then, as the system gets built up and the pieces get more and more complicated, we need to start asking the second question: did we build the right thing? Does it do what we want and expect it to do? And that's validation. And that too starts at the very lowest level, right? And we build that up as we go, as the pieces come together and get more and more complicated. And we go, I really like Brian's chart that showed, you go from sort of a complex system that you can't necessarily predict how it's going to behave, but ultimately we're going to have to understand that. And then, that's the whole process of going up, down the V and back up the V. You go from a concept or a thought or a system that's very complicated, you try to push it down to something simple that you can then engineer. But then as you walk back up the V, you have to do this verification validation. So you verify the simple things, the things you can, you validate it as it gets more complicated, and then you have to, at the end, the last question, do we understand how and why the thing we built works the way it does? And that's characterization, right? Because some of at the end game, at the final stages of the LSST coming together, we can't necessarily predict exactly how it's going to work, but we need to know that, right? In order to do the science, we need to know how it works. So those are my guiding principles going forward, as far as pulling together everybody in this room to make this thing happen. Is that as we go forward from here forward, I'm asking you to keep these three questions in the back of your mind as you do your work. And then as a project, we use the word commissioning to mean it's kind of an umbrella word, right? It's not commissioning in the strictest sense of many other smaller projects. We use, as I said at the beginning, a very broad definition. So for us in LSST, commissioning includes this final stage of integrating the camera, the telescope, the data management system, the EPO system. So when we say commissioning on this project, we also mean system integration and test at the final stages of that, with these big pieces coming together. It includes system level verification. So at the high level, at the telescope camera, data management, and EPO level, we want to ask ourselves, did we actually build what we said we're going to build? It also includes validation of the science pipelines or in the science products. So this is how we answer, did we build the right thing? Are we getting out of it what we expected to get out of it? It includes characterizing the system as it is being built, right? Because as Brian was saying, I agree with Brian 100% that this LSST is a complex system. And to understand some of that emergent behavior that we're going to get at the end of the day, we need to do a little bit of early work to understand how the individual pieces behave themselves. Because some of the individual pieces are complex in of themselves, not just the whole LSST, but the telescope is a complex thing. The camera is a complex thing. The whole data management software suite is a complex thing, and you can't always predict exactly how it's going to work until you actually use it. And then lastly, we have to understand the final product. How does LSST, as a complete observatory system, behave and work? And I will conclude my short presentation with just a reminder of some interesting dates that are in our future. And in particular, the first date up there is not all that far away. It's a little over a year away. And that's when real pixels are expected to start coming from our mountaintop from the auxiliary telescope. And, that's when we start that's when the end game really is in our face, right? Is starting a little over a year from now. But I hope that you can understand that with trying to understand and verify and validate and characterize this complicated machine that we're building, that commissioning isn't something that's some far away milepost 3 years down the road. It is really starting now. It has started, right? It has started with all of you at the verification level when you're verifying your piece of the puzzle. And so, we need to think going forward that this whole integration, test, commissioning is one giant continuum. It's not, my piece and I toss it over the wall, and another person gets their piece, they toss it over the wall. It comes. It's just this. We're now into this flow of all these parts coming together, and so you will hear from Brian and I and others when we come around and poking and prodding, and we're trying to build up that understanding. So bear with us, but I think it's an investment worth investing in. And I'll stop there, and now I think it's time for me to turn it over to Beth to say a word or two. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Is this okay where it is on my shirt? I've got a little bit. Okay, great. So Brian and Chuck, thank you, Ian. Great, thank you. Thank you for those excellent talks. I just have a couple of slides here. to talk a little bit about a question that's been one of great interest on both the project and the community side of house, and that's commissioning data and what's going to happen with the data and who may have access to it. Now, as Chuck nicely described, commissioning activities are starting now, even though we're a few years away from any data flowing into the LSST system. And so even though we're still a few years away from the actual flow of data, the question of what is the data access or the data rights policy for commissioning is of great interest now for a few reasons. One, of course, the science community wants to know, when can I get my hands on LSST data? How can I plan to best prepare for LSST data? When am I going to be able to fold in some real life observations into my planning and preparation process? And then on the project side of the house, we're looking at getting ready for operations and planning for what sort of activities will take place during a 4-year pre-operations ramp up to the 10-year survey between fiscal year 19 and fiscal year 22. And so it can be of great advantage to the pre-operations team to use the vetting, the analysis, and the distribution of at least some of the commissioning data as a way to really prepare the team to be ready for effective and efficient operations on day one, and also to get early feedback, to ingest and react to early feedback from the community on the LSST data itself to strengthen our readiness for the start of full operations. So there's a lot of possible advantages, both on the LSST side of the house and in the community, to figuring out how we can do some early distribution of data before the start of full operations. And so with those sorts of interests in mind, we've had a number of conversations over the last year with both community members, the project science team, folks within the project, folks who are going to be responsible for commissioning, our managing organizations, and representatives from the agencies to think about what might an appropriate policy be to communicate at this stage in the game. Because with so many years away, there's a lot of things we don't quite know yet, what resources will be available, what will be the most effective way to distribute data at the time. And so we're doing our best to have written a policy that'll clarify expectations and boundary conditions while deferring specifics for a couple of years when we flesh things out more. And so that's what these few slides are intended to communicate. So one of the balances that we wanted to make is, thinking about the benefit of the early science and early preparation with the need of the commissioning team to really focus on commissioning and getting ready for the operations readiness review, and also the balance between giving super users, throwing them data over the wall as soon as possible, but staying true to the LSST ethos of all data rights holders having an equal opportunity to access the data at the same time. And again, because a big part of the benefit for both the project and community of this potential early data distribution is getting the feedback and reacting to community feedback, we want to be sure that we have the structures and the staffing to, again, ingest and react to that feedback if we're going to go ahead and release any data. So in this interest, we would like to release data from each of the 3 stages of commissioning after that stage of commissioning is over, and then with a few month buffer held to, again, do this preparation, to do the data vetting, and to get the necessary processes in place. So assuming the milestone schedule that Chuck just showed on his last slide, one could imagine a straw man schedule on which a pre-operations team could, on a best effort basis, disseminate some of the commissioning data. And I highlight these as sort of by half-year fidelity, imagining potentially the first part of 2021 would be a time with that schedule as presented. ComCam data could be distributed much later that year, close to the end of the year for full camera data, and then relatively earlier in 2022 could be a time that mini surveys data would be distributed. And to put that in some perspective, we're currently planning, to have 2 data releases based on the first year of full survey operations. With after the first 6 months of data are acquired, there will be a 6 months or so period to process and distribute those data in a formal data release during operations. And the schedule for that is expected to be late calendar year 2023, which is early fiscal year 2024. And instead of answering right now exactly which data products will be released when and how that is all going to look, the plan is for an early instantiation of the data release board, which will be the cross operations team board that will be involved with all of the steps involved with producing the formal annual data releases. To have an early instantiation of that board, start to exercise their practices to develop the criteria for which products will be released, which images will be released, in close consultation with the Science Advisory Committee. And those conversations will start at the beginning of commissioning operations. The data management team and the emerging data facility are working towards the start of full operations to have the full capacity at the Data Archive and Access Center and have the full functionality ready to serve out to thousands of users for the science platform. And so we'll be cautious and careful as we distribute these data during commissioning. And I want to say now that the minimum products that would be distributed would be flat files, FITS files and tables. And then again, several years from now, we'll have a better sense of what the appropriate distribution channel will be like. Keeping in mind, of course, that as much as we can on the best effort basis, the pre-operations team will want to get the community exposure to and experience with the actual user interfaces that late 2023 first data release will be delivered through. And that's all I've got. So Brian, you're the boss. What do we do now? Questions for everyone or go to the panel? And so now, Brian will welcome our panel speakers to the front.
So as Brian said, this is a little bit of an experiment. We'll see how this goes. So we've asked 6 people from the project that have various kinds of experience working on other telescopes, instruments, data systems, spacecraft to come up, and we asked them to think about their experiences and what lessons could we learn as we move forward into this end game. What advice or just some anecdotes about what they experienced that we can learn from. And I'm going to start very quickly and try not to occupy too much time here. But so when I first came to NOAO, so I came to Tucson right out of grad school. I came to NOAO as a staff scientist. The WIN 3.5 meter telescope on Kitt Peak was being commissioned at the time, and I was asked to participate in that commissioning effort and examine the image quality performance of the telescope. So one of the things I did is I put a high-speed camera on that telescope, and it ran at 200 frames per second, and I wanted to characterize what the image motion looked like. And to my shock, I saw that there was something like a 0.2 to 0.3 arc second peak-to-peak 23 hertz vibration wiggling the image around back and forth. And long story short, we had no clue as to why that was happening. And it took us 4 months to trace it down. I was at my wit's end, and at one point I was sitting in the dome with my laptop with a battery-powered accelerometer on the telescope and pulled the mains on the observatory. No power whatsoever, 0, except for my battery and my laptop. The vibration was still there. That did not make sense. And it turned out that the secondary mirror on that telescope, there was 4 points that attached it. And so not to be over-constrained kinematically, only 3 points were used. And it turned out that this vibration was the secondary mirror rocking back and forth across the diagonal of the 3 points. And I just scratched out on a piece of paper that it happened to be that the sound travel time across the diameter of the dome was about the equivalent of 23 hertz, 1/23 seconds. And so the bad news is that it was just being acoustically driven, and the good news is that that meant that the Q of the oscillation was incredibly high, which means you could easily damp it. So we put a dash pot on the 4th leg, and it went away. And so the lessons there, right, is for me is, and this is why you hear me preaching to this all the time, is, it took us 4 months to get there. And I think we could have avoided that by being a little bit more systematic in characterizing the behavior of this complicated machine as we went to anticipate this emergent behavior. So what I'm going to ask the panelists to do now is, so that's my anecdote, is to introduce themselves, maybe a sentence or two about their background, and then provide your anecdote. So how are we on time, Brian? What's our time? 40 minutes. Okay, so let's see, try to keep it to around 5 minutes or so we can have some time for questions. So I'm going to start off with Francisco Delgado.
Good morning, Francisco Delgado. I'm the software manager for the telescope site team, and I have previous experience in a couple of observatories. One that is relevant for the commissioning is the VLT. I was participating as a software developer for the commissioning section of the plan, and between years 1999 and 2002. So I was part of the commissioning team for UT2, UT3, and UT4. We had the luxury of having clones of the telescope, so we can experiment in one without breaking the next one. One particular anecdote, which was a software problem that was really hard to find, but those problems that are really easy to fix as when we find it. It's I was in charge of the active optics system, and during all the commissioning and testing images for the image analyzer software in local VxWorks-based computer. We had this all the time, waveform sensing working in closed loop. And after several months, we discovered that the residual RMS of the images were to the roof, everything crazy, and it was rarely happening, like once a week or something for just some minutes. So it was very hard to reproduce. So I developed a system for gathering all the data from the telemetry bus. We didn't have an engineering facility database or equivalent of that. So we didn't have a history of all the telemetry, which we will have for our control system. So I trained the night operator for detecting the condition and to execute a script that I prepared in order to capture everything that we might think is relevant to the condition. And we captured many of those events. And we had some scientists and engineers analyzing all the data. And after like 2 months of getting some of these conditions and analyzing it, we discovered that when doing the fitting of the surface over the waveform phone, we were building some planes for all the surface fitting. And we expected at least three of the spots to be defined in each of the planes that we needed to fit for the surface. But we didn't consider the case when the 3 spots were perfectly aligned in one line. So there's no plane being possible to be defined in such conditions. The software didn't cover that. So that was exactly the reason why we did a huge residual RMS. But lesson learned, we have to capture all the data all the time because it's very expensive and a specific, very detailed work.
Cool. Interesting. So next up is Sandrine Thomas, our telescope scientist.
Hi, so yes, I'm Sandrine Thomas, telescope scientist. I started as an optical engineer really for telescopes, and that was about in 2001. I started at the SOAR telescope, working on the adaptive optics system, and my integration experience comes from the Gemini Planet Imager, which is a very high contrast imaging instrument with a lot of moving parts, with a lot of very dedicated hardware. And one of my anecdotes, I guess, was I was in the lab integrating and pushing the system, and somehow the RTC, the real-time computer, was blocked. And I thought I had the right procedure in mind. I didn't turn off the deformable mirrors. We had 2 deformable mirrors, and it turns out that I did not do the right thing because I was trying to get the software engineer who was away on a trip and was not in circle range, and he got my message, and we started the system the following day, except that because the decoder was on, I killed 9 children. And that was a very big deal because we had to redo the pupil plane, which costs about 6 months to delay, and that was a huge tip. So the lesson learned from that was that having a good procedure written in front of my eye would have actually avoided the 6 months delay. So that's what I would say. And the other lesson learned from GPI in general was to have very good coordination. So morning meetings, emails, or log about who's working on the system when and what the results of that work is done. That's very key as well, to make productive meetings in the mornings and to make sure that everybody is on the same page. And that was very key.
Good.
And the last thing, have fun.
Always good advice.
All right, my name is Kevin Reel. I work at Slack on the camera team. I wrote down a few notes of things I might share. I think first I'd like to give a shout out to Alistair Walker, who worked on commissioning with me on dark energy camera. And one of the things that I really learned with that experience was Alistair had put together a really great plan. And then he expressed in words that we should expect it wasn't going to go according to plan. And it didn't. But it really helped me go in with the right attitude, right? I flew down to Chile. I assumed sometime in the next 3 weeks I'm going to be able to do what I came down here to do, and I don't know when, and that's okay. Be patient. And so if there's one thing I could share is that for those of you that are assist us in commissioning, we really will do our very best to have a good plan put together, and then you should be prepared to be flexible. But I think the two things I really wanted to share were from my very, very young life. When I was commissioning 63 4-meter telescopes. And before you think that's really cool, we had cameras that were 256 pixels each. And my first job was commissioning these cameras. They were photomultiplier clusters. And I was working in the back of one of these cameras, and I turned around to get something, and I bumped it. And out of the corner of my eye, I saw the camera falling off the table. And I was a brand new dad, so I had like cat-like reflexes, and I grabbed it. And, it was like $100,000, so, it was like more money than I'd ever imagined in the world at the time. I was a grad student. And there was 2 things that could have happened next. One is that I could have just not told anyone. And the other one was to go tell my supervisor what had happened, who said, you know what, we probably should secure that to the table. And so it's not my job, it's not Chuck's job, Chuck Gessner, it's everyone's job to look for things that will keep people safe and keep our equipment safe. I have another story that involves a 4-meter mirror in the sun. I'll skip that, you can imagine. It was bad. But really, commissioning is going to be a very, very busy and somewhat potentially chaotic time. But really, we have to take the time to make sure we're working safe. And I think that's everyone's job. So please keep that in mind.
So before Robert starts, you said something else too in there that caught my ear, that, we all are feeling the stress levels in this project are starting to ramp up. It's only going to get more intense as we get deeper into integration and test and commissioning. And you said a word that really resonated with me, and that's patience. And I think that's a lesson to be learned too, is that as we go into commissioning and we start working, we're gonna have to start working together closely as a fully integrated team, and some things aren't gonna be going exactly the way we want it to go, and we have to be patient with each other to work through some of these problems and get them solved. So
I think the thing I enjoyed most from all of the commissioning experiences is that keeping a smile on my face as I went even through the challenges. So try that.
Mr. Lupton.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm Robert Lupton. I moved back to Fredericton to work on Space Telescope, and we decided that there was a minor commissioning problem on Space Telescope, which was at the the mirror was the wrong shape. So we built the Sloan instead. Lessons from Sloan, which is now a long time ago, include that we integrated all the different parts of the project together. I wrote a lot of software for the reprocessing, a lot of Yoko, but also I wrote the electrical control stuff because that's what we needed to do. We were on the mountain every dark round. We had the electronic engineers there, in this case, Connie, we had Gunn, we had me. Get together on the mountain is a very powerful way to find out cross-system problems. The next thing you learned from Sloan was that Jim Gunn, who's probably the best instrumentalist in the world, broke the secondary mirror because he made a mistake. People make mistakes. Even the best people in the world make mistakes. And that's going to happen. You happen to catch your camera, but you know, if you do it twice, then that's a mistake. You're allowed to break things once.
Robert, do you recall what the mistake was?
It was a hard point. Error somewhere calculating whether you could run the hard points or not.
It was, we did hear that we replaced the supports for the secondary. Was it a phaser or
Yeah, come up to the microphone,
okay,
Russ.
So Russell wanted to go into more detail. We changed the supports, we changed the piezo's, and that basically ended up getting into trouble.
Jim Gunn wanted more precise positioning of the secondary. He designed some new supports that contained piezos in them. We took them to the observatory. I put them together. I installed them, but I forgot to measure the length to make sure it was the same as the old supports, and they weren't. They were shorter. And so when the mirror got homed, it was pulled all the way back, and there was a lot of the mirror center of the mirror touched part of the support system and was pulled hard, and the center popped out. Wow! It took a few days for that to happen, but the lesson from that is this was long after commissioning. This was a change partway through the project. In my opinion, the lesson from that is don't let your guard down. Just because you have a working telescope doesn't mean you can't break something later. So if you have upgrades, be careful.
Thank you, Russ. And this also speaks to one of Brian's points towards the end of his talk, is that details matter. So go ahead, Robert, start.
So I think the next thing I commissioned was the ACT telescope, which is at 5,100 meters in Chile, and the main problem there was diesel gelling at those temperatures and problem with bandits coming over the border from Bolivia. So very different set of problems that we had on the SDSS, but they both caused real trouble because they work. And the next instrument was SupremeCam. Here's an image. On the left is a dome flat, this is Y-band. On the right is a sky flat. And you will see that the edge of the field is vignetting corrected, is brighter than the center of the field. That's totally impossible. It took Gunn and me about 5 months sorting out what was going on here. And it turns out that the filters are more sensitive at the edge of the field than the middle. I used to go out to Hawaii every month because it was the only way to get communication from the Japanese. And eventually I said, I figured it out. I think the filters have a bigger bandwidth at the edge. And they said, oh, yeah, we have some scans somewhere. Would you like to see them? The answer was yes. It also explained the flat field structure we were struggling over in R, the fact we weren't seeing ghosting in R. You were seeing, again, we were coupling the filters to nice skylines, all sorts of things. So communication would have been really helpful there. And finally, if you look at those two images, I looked at them this morning when I pulled up this slide, you'll see there's a feature on the right-hand image, which I've never really paid attention to. Now, that's light coming off the encoders. It turns out that we have some light about a micron. We discovered this later in spades. In fact, Yosra showed these same features again. But now I go back and look at the data we were dealing with while we were fighting much bigger problems. I say, oh, I could have discovered back then that we had problems coming off the encoders and getting into data. But we didn't, because you don't capture everything, you go back and find it.
Thank you, Robert. Will.
So I'm William Molan. I've worked in ESA for many years in different areas, from control systems all the way up to the last 12 years where I've been working on Gaia through construction into commissioning and operations, and then all the other missions. And I have to say, the only mission that I've seen where there was no problems in commissioning so far was NISA Pathfinder. That was an engineering mission more than a science mission. But it was the only one. This picture hopefully is the first light image from Gaia. And you know, if you weren't actually working on Gaia, this looks really horrible. Gaia wasn't spinning, it's meant to spin, it reads out TDI, so this is Seychelles there is being TDI topped out on the CCD, so it's actually fantastic image. It's perfectly exactly what we were expecting to see. Things went a bit downhill from there. So, you know, Gaia is a space mission, as Brian said, and he said, we do extensive verification, extensive validation, all the way through from the beginning to the end, and you still run into problems. So Gaia had a bunch of things, most of you probably know, there's basic angle variations, not as stable as it's supposed to be, the stray light problems, the fibers sticking out from the edge of the sun shield, all of these things you have to discover as you go along the way. And they flow downhill to us people who work in cold science operations, or DM in the case here, because what happens is these spaces never get fixed, because although you just fix them in software, you can characterize them, you can characterize it. So I know what's coming to me on LSST. You have a key in there. You get some of it. Probably so. But, so again, mission took us 3 months and ended up being about 6 months, which is still short. LSST. There's really quite a lot of analysis, a lot of scientists sitting in institutes, a lot of people looking at the world of data, trying to figure out these problems, other problems, water and vapor problems that go inside. LSST will be no different, I'm sure we should pay attention to that. It was a great experience. It was fantastic to be part of this enterprise. I'm looking forward to the same with LSST. I think planning is the activity that I should go to that level as well, so I've heard that over the year. The time doesn't work, but if you don't have it, you're even worse off. The other thing I would say is that everything goes reasonably well if you have clear channels of communication, so I've heard that from over. You need to establish very clear channels of communication, and it's also command and control. You decide that you do this, you can go do this. Everybody can remain happy.
Thanks, Will. And last but not least,
yeah,
Frosty.
so now I
Hi,
get
Frosty.
to disagree with everybody constructively. No, I'm kidding. So my name is Frosty, and I'm in data management. I work for Will in Tucson. Before I was a desk jockey on a vaporware telescope. For many years I worked on one of CARE telescopes, and so I've been part of several instrument commissionings, more than half a dozen, 2 major telescope recommissionings after very heavy engineering and upgrades, and 2 complete software overhauls. And I will say that commissioning is can be the best of times or the worst of times, and it's usually the best of times if you get it right, and it is an incredible experience. I'm very excited to see LSST go into commissioning. So I apologize if this point seems a little bit obvious, but even the obvious things are important and need to work and planning to happen. The one thing I learned in commissioning is that, of course, it's a very exciting time, everybody has contributed, and everybody wants to be in the freaking control room. We learned early on to be very brutal about this. If you weren't holding a spanner in your hand, you did not get to be in the control room. Otherwise, everybody wants to be there. The software people want to be there, the astronomers want to be there. I'm sorry, but the freaking directors want to be there. Nothing makes your heart sink more than the knock on the door and then the directors walk in and they're going, oh, what's happening? Don't do that. It's understandable. Now, I agree with Robert that it's important to have people together to talk about problems, but this should not be in the control room, then this should be somewhere else. And the corollary for that is that everybody who is somewhere else trying to solve problems has to have a very good understanding of what is happening. in the telescope in the control room. And we heard some of this before. It's very important to have data and telemetry, micro switches on absolutely everything. Machine readable, very accessible logs that have been, well narrated, that do say things like, at midnight I heard a clunking noise, so that somebody can go back later and correlate something happening in the data stream with the clunking noise. And my favorite example, because people think about it and go like a big bloody deal, but my favorite example is we were commissioning Scuba 2 on GCMT, which is an extremely sensitive sub-millimeter bolometer array. The detectors on Scuba 2 are actually at an operational cold temperature of 70 millikelvin. It was actually, for a while, we believed it was the longest continuously cooled place in the universe. It's actually cooler than empty space. The cryogenics for the system were incredibly complicated, and we anticipated problems, and we were geared for problems, but there was this transient noise that would appear, and then disappear, and it would appear, and then it would disappear. And we went crazy. We had checked everything, we were having people turn off their walkie-talkies and their phones, and we would look at the temperatures, we would look at the wind speeds, we would look at everything we could think of. And several months later, somebody realized it was when the mechanical engineers were playing music in the dome. The instrument was so sensitive, it was actually getting microphonics from the music. And so this is the kind of thing you really have to watch out for. And you can never have too much information, too much telemetry, too much details. The other thing I will say is something that Will said that struck very close to home, which is, it is certainly true that there is an expectation that some problems will be fixed in the data processing. And while it is true that this can happen, I really believe that in a complex system like the one that Brian described, there is kind of a Vulcan nerve pinch place. There is an optimal place in the system to fix a problem. And quite often that is well upstream. I mean, you can have a very modest change from somebody who's writing the header control system or the readout for a microswitch that is going to produce a much cleaner, more robust, and more efficient solution than working around that in the code. And I think in a situation where we have lots of distributed teams and everybody's problems seem the most important, it's actually important to also look at the overall health of the system and find the right place to fix a problem. And finally, I'll say, beware of workarounds. Workarounds never die. You do something in the middle of commissioning because you're trying to work around some problem, and like 3 years later you go up and cult-like the same workaround is being applied, even though the problem has long been fixed. So even though it's a very busy time and there's lots of things to do, it's worth taking the time sometimes to fix something properly. And I'll stop even though I can just go.
Thanks a lot, Frosty, and all the other panelists. We have some time now for either questions or other stories from the audience. Can ask anything you want about commissioning or verification with Brian up here, but the microphones are open.
Hello, you've each been involved in numerous past projects at stages anywhere from being a grad student to managing it. In that time, have you seen the projects that you've been involved in learn the lessons that were not learned in the earlier projects that you were involved in? As in, do we have hope?
Robert's shaking his head no. I hope that's only somewhat sarcastic. Anybody care to, any of our panelists care to field that a little bit? Will?
Yeah, so the space agency is quite organized about trying to remember history. I think that's true of NASA, that's true of all space agencies. problems that you have with something like LSST is you're an organization that's building up to do this. You don't have a history as an organization to remember problems from previous telescopes. The other problem that happens is inevitably each of these projects is super better than the previous one and brings with it its own new set of problems which you couldn't have anticipated. So I think the recurring theme across here was you have to expect the unexpected. If something's going to go wrong, you have to just deal with it. But yes, the lessons are learned, and I think we learned lots of lessons coming into Gaia. We brought a lot of experienced people in. I think LSST is the same. You bring a lot of experienced people together. They bring those lessons. They say, oh, we shouldn't do that. We should do that. And hopefully some of those are listened to and we agree on them. Some we disagree on them. That's fine. So there is hope.
Kevin, you were back at us.
Sure, people still drop things. And people still lose their cool when under stress. And reminding yourself, right, about the complacency that Brian showed. You can get complacent with how you treat others, and you can get complacent with safety. You can get complacent with following procedures, and all of those things can lead to bad things. So we shouldn't get complacent in any of those.
Thanks. So it's interesting. I'm hearing, in trying to synthesize what all the panelists have said. A key element to successful commissioning is I would summarize it in awareness. Right, it's an awareness about what the system is doing. It's an awareness of your fellow partners in this, the people around you. That we talk about telemetry, we talk about communication. It's all a different form of awareness. And there's one other kind of awareness that we haven't talked about, and it's because I'm a hardware guy. We did this on an early instrument that I was working on up at Kitt Peak. We were having filter change problems, and sometimes the filter would change properly, other times it wouldn't, and we really weren't getting very far with understanding why. And we decided to put a microphone up there next to the filter changer, and you would be amazed at how much you can learn just from what a mechanism sounds like when it's going through its motions and operations, and you your brain just gets trained to what it's supposed to sound like. And then when it doesn't sound that way, your brain is very good at picking that up. And then you can quickly, I've identified a moment in time when the sound wasn't right. And then now you know where to dig in the telemetry to understand it. Robert's about to say something, and then I'll turn it over to Charles.
We have a microphone up at the Supreme Camp, which you listen to, and we once heard the sound of a screw going, which you really don't want to hear.
But the question, Robert, is, did you find the screw?
I think it's somewhere in the filter changer mechanism. It may still be as well.
You didn't find the screw.
The thing we did find when we took the smoke camera apart was the fan blade that Jim broke off because he couldn't be bothered to break the power out when he was trying to do something down in there. That didn't come out until we took the machine apart a year or two later.
John.
So thank you, Kevin. We're all in this together, and I think communication is something that's really key. The other thing, too, that we've established within our project is the work stop authority. And there's a number of us in this room that experienced a very devastating occurrence right before DECCAM the project started, right? So the F8 accident. And one of the things that we found when we investigated that particular accident that hurt somebody and damaged the mirror, we did eventually repair it after several $100,000 and a year's worth of work, is that the people that were actually doing the job knew something was wrong, but they were afraid to say anything. And so we immediately instilled a work stop authority. And one other lesson that we learned from that is that we forgot that glass is sacred. And so whenever we're moving glass at LSST, you can guarantee I will be there, because I'm going to instill with the people that work there that glass is sacred.
So I just want to say a little bit about both those comments. So it is true, as Chuck said, we must be patient, and and we must be safe, and we must keep all those things in mind. But we actually know a lot about human beings, and we know a lot about conditions that make it easier or harder to achieve that, patient and careful and well thought out state. And we know things that are antithetical to that, and one of them is being overwhelmed, being tired, and being stressed. And one of the things that we learned after many commissionings is that you start off by making this very big commissioning list, and you add up how long it's going to take, and it says, for an instrument commissioning, say it's 6 weeks. So you start off. By week 2, you tried and you're stressed, and now you have found more problems that you can fix, and this list is getting longer, and this is how this thing starts. So one of the things that we found, it was actually more productive to have a 3-week commissioning period than shut the freaking telescope down for a month and then come back for another 3-week period, because in the first 3 weeks you have found enough things to work on that you really want to deal with before it's actually worthwhile to keep going. And then people can get some sleep, they can do their laundry. And so I would say less haste, more speed. Beware of these factors, beware of just getting into that position where you think you're working very hard because you put in a 100-hour week, but in fact you're becoming less and less effective, more and more stressed, and everybody around you is in the same situation. So just take your time, plan lots of breaks, is kind of my advice to that, and that helps everybody be safe and be happy.
It's in my plan.
And I would add to that, so she said take breaks and things like that, but I would say make sure you're flexible as well. So we had to do a few design changes in the process. We had to do 6 months for work on actuators, and there was another misalignment in the system. So just be flexible into the planning. Yes, we need to plan, but we also we need to know when to change that plan and how.
Yep. Francisco.
Yeah, I can contribute in the same tone that specifically in software development. During construction, we are used to our process, implementing requirements, design, testing, releases. We have time. We think we don't have time, but actually compared to the totally different rhythm during integration and commissioning, we need to react really fast. The sprints now are for weeks, 2 weeks. The sprints there are like hours sometimes. You need to turn around, move very quickly, some solutions, sometimes diagnosing your code, your system with 4 people in your back, and coming up with something that you have to create and be creative and understand your system, understand the problem that your system is addressing. That's critical. And we have to react fast. And answers like, that's not a requirement, it's not an answer. We have to create the requirements afterwards, something to define that. We have to fix the problem, and during daytime, nighttime, it's 24/7.
Russell.
Well, one thing we found very helpful, and I know you're doing the best you can on it, was to have simulators. So, for example, I wrote the high-level TCS for the Apache Point telescopes, and the person who was doing the low-level stuff gave me a box that pretended to be a low-level controller, and it made all the difference. We got it up in no time instead of spending weeks and months on them out and trying to get them to talk to each other. So any time you can give somebody a box that does what it's supposed to do and pretends to be running the hardware it's supposed to be running, you come out way ahead when it comes time of commissioning. Get it done now. The other thing I wanted to say is second what Frosty said. Watching people maintain the telescope during our shutdown periods and bringing it up during commissioning, it was like watching sausage being made, and that shouldn't be that way. People picking up light baffles, they're right next to the primary mirror is facing up, they're holding it in their hand and handing it off the side of the telescope. Sloan had this philosophy that on-sky time was sacred. that any time given to the engineers to mess with the telescope was time taken away from extremely expensive, valuable on-sky time. And you can't, it's not a good idea. Sloan was very productive. It's proud of its productivity, rightfully so. But you have to give the engineers time to do the work carefully and get enough sleep instead of 12-hour days during the shutdown period. So both during commissioning and during engineering shutdowns, I encourage you to back off on the on-sky time is money and give people time to do it safely.
Thanks, Russell. And I think we have time for Tim, and then we're getting close to the end of our session here. So, Tim,
okay,
you're on.
I just want to follow on from what Francisco said. That you will be changing the software all the time during commissioning. And there is nothing worse than starting the next day, doing the observing, and then realizing that there's some weird problem that was fixed yesterday because a redeployment happened in the morning and your fix didn't go in, and it's in the Git repo, but it's not deployed. And you've got to be very careful with your deployment of software. You don't want to deploy the fix in one location and not the other. It has to be consistently known everywhere what's going on. And you need a way of being able to deploy the thing you fixed last night into the test environments and get everything so into known state. Otherwise, you're going to be chasing your tail for the first couple of hours of every night. And you don't want to be doing that.
That's why I'm going to come to you, Tim, and help. You're going to help me figure out exactly how we're going to manage that.
So I've been trying to stay off all my software stories because it will bore half the people, but you know, not only this is an important point that we always recognize, but I think it's actually, I want to bring the one thing that actually does not come up very often. Yes, we have to do lots of quick, rapid and secure deployments. And yes, we need to know what version of what state the system was in, and absolutely signal errors are critical in ensuring safe deployments. The flip side of that is it has to be really easy to revert back to a previous version. And that's sometimes underscoped, but you are very risk tolerant in that situation. In fact, I have found that even astronomers in operations are very risk tolerant. They do want to try the new version because they do want that feature you just put in. But the flip side of that is occasionally that will go wrong. You don't have time to do full testing, and so you have to be able to just go back to where you were very easily. And if you do that, it actually relieves a lot of pressure and stops you from that kind of vicious circle where you deploy something, it has a bug, and then you try to fix it, and the fix is a bug, and then you're chasing the bugs all the way down. So version control is a wonderful thing.
Thank you, Frosty. I think we're at the end of our time. I think it's, I thought this little experiment worked out all right. Let's thank our panelists here. And enjoy your coffee break. For those that came in a little bit late and are unawares, the commissioning rehearsal that Will, myself, and Keith Bechtel will be running got moved into this room here, so we have space. So enjoy your coffee break. Thank you very much.